Zonda Kids presents the Jesus Storybook Bible. Every story whispers his name. Written by Sally Lloyd-Jones and read by David Suchet. The King of all kings. Far away in the east, 3 clever men saw the very same star, the star that God had put in the sky when Jesus was born. They knew it was a sign. A baby king had been born. They had been waiting for this star. They knew it would come. "He's here," they shouted. "He's here." And I'm sure if you'd been there, you would have heard them laughing and dancing and singing until the sun came up. At dawn, they packed up their camels and wrapped gifts for the baby. They brought their most precious treasures of all, frankincense, gold, and myrrh. Special, sparkly, lovely smelling, gleaming things, just right for a king. The 3 wise men, actually, if you'd met them, you'd have thought they were kings because they were so rich and clever and important looking. Anyway, they set off. They rode their camels across endless deserts, up steep, steep mountains, down into deep, deep valleys, through raging rivers, over grassy plains, night and day and night, for hours that turned into days, that turned into weeks, that turned into months and months, until at last they reached Jerusalem. Jerusalem was by far the most important city for miles around, and as anyone can tell you, that's where a palace would be, and kings are born in palaces. So that's where they went. But they were in for a surprise. They went to see King Herod. Surely he'd know where this baby was, but he didn't. In fact, he didn't like the sound of a new king. It made him cross. He didn't want anyone to be king except him. But Herod's advisors told the 3 wise men what was written in their books, what God had said about the baby king. "Go to Bethlehem. That's where you'll find him." Suddenly, the star they had seen in the east started moving again, showing them the way. So the 3 wise men followed the star out of the big city, along the road, into the little town of Bethlehem. They followed the star through the streets of Bethlehem, out of the nice part of town, through the not-so-nice part of town, into the really not nice at all part of town, down a little dirt track until it stopped right over a little house. But wait, it wasn't a palace, and there weren't any guards or servants or flags or red carpets or trumpets or anything. Did they get it wrong? Or was this what God meant? Sure enough, in that little house, there sitting on his mother's knee, they found him, the baby king. The 3 men knelt before the little king. They took off their rich royal turbans and gleaming golden crowns. They bowed their noble heads to the ground and gave him their sparkling treasures. The journey that had begun so many centuries before had led 3 wise men here, to a little town, to a little house, to a little child, to the king God had promised David all those years before. But this child was a new kind of king. Though he was the Prince of Heaven, he had become poor, though he was the mighty God, he had become a helpless baby. This king hadn't come to be the boss. He had come to be a servant.
All right. I hope you enjoyed that. Jesus Storybook Bible is one of my favorites to read personally. Honestly, I like it on its own, but of course, it's a great gift and a great book to read to your children. When we started the service, it occurred to me that when it comes to this idea of, and I just realized I put the wrong slide up there. I spend so much effort making these nice slides and I make a mistake. But our sermon today is about the visitors of Jesus, the visitors of Jesus. And the thing about that is, as we sang the very first song that we sang this morning, typically when we think of the visitors of Jesus, it's really the angels that get the most, not the angels, the shepherds that get the most kind of airtime in our worship services and sermons and so on. However, the thing about that is the shepherds actually never appear in the Gospel of Matthew. Right? So this is something to really know about the narrative, the birth narrative of Jesus that you're probably very familiar with. It's really an amalgamation of the version that's in Matthew and the version that's in Luke. And Luke is the version that has the shepherds and the angels, where Matthew has the story of the wise men that came and visited Jesus. So in this sense, since we are only in the Gospel of Matthew for this Christmas sermon series, we are only going to be covering the three wise men. The Magi is what others call them, and we'll just sing about the shepherds and the angels, because I'm sure for the next couple of weeks we're going to keep singing these wonderful songs, Gloria, Gloria in excelsis Deo, right? So we'll just set those aside. We're so familiar with that. But let's have a look instead to the three Magi, the three wise men, or at least what we know of or what we think of as the three wise men, as we turn our attention to the story of Jesus' birth. But before that, let me just talk, or let me tell you real quickly about this conversation that I had with a friend of mine. He's Vietnamese, but he lives in Tokyo. So we chat every a couple of times a week, and so on. This past week, a week ago, we were chatting, of all things, about the pardon that Joe Biden gave to his son Hunter, right? Now, we don't talk politics at all. It just happened to be in the news at that time, and so he was asking me about it. He wasn't so much interested in this idea of Joe Biden pardoning Hunter, which I'm sure people have something to believe and to say about. What he's really more kind of amazed at is this idea of a pardon in the first place. Right, so he asked me basically, does Canada have the same thing? Can prisoners essentially can convicted felons be pardoned by in Canada? And I was honest with him. I didn't really actually know the answer, so I quickly looked it up. And sure enough, yes, actually, it is possible for a prisoner, a convicted felon, to be pardoned here in Canada. And the person who can do that is actually the king, right? So I told him that. I didn't want to get into the whole political situation. And I was like, the king can pardon people in Canada. And that surprised him. Now, he not because of the concept of a king. He lived in Japan, of course, where they have an emperor. But the fact that Canada had a king. So I ended up having to explain to him the whole situation. Anyways, basically, King Charles is also the king and he's represented by the governor general, at least at the federal level, right? So for those of you who weren't aware of the way the government works, that's basically it. The king is technically, King Charles is technically the head of state of Canada. We have a king. He's the King of Canada, and the Governor General is the one who represents him here. However, just like in the UK, and just like the emperor in Japan, and just like basically every monarchy that still exists today, except probably the ones in like the Middle East or in Thailand, really the monarchies that we have are just ceremonial, right? They don't really hold any real power. Right? In fact, this whole idea of a pardon being given by the king, or at least the governor general, is a really great example of that. So in the United States, the American president has the power. He has the right, he has the power to sign a piece of paper and say, that's it. You are no longer considered to be convicted for this crime. That is his personal power to have. Now, obviously, the president probably doesn't choose every single person that he pardons. In the news, in fact, recently, we heard that Joe Biden has pardoned 39 people and has commuted the sentences. So meaning commuted the sentence, meaning they had a longer sentence and they reduced it, right? So maybe it was a life sentence, they reduced to 20 years instead, right? He commuted the sentences of 15. Right, so people are saying that's the largest number of pardons and commutations that an American president has ever given. But basically, the idea there is that the American president is just that powerful in the American government. They can do it. They can pardon. Likely the president didn't choose every single one of those people to pardon. He delegated that task likely to a group of people who got the applications and the requests for pardon, and he basically signed and agreed with that, but it was his power to have. But here in Canada, the king or the governor general doesn't actually have that power. Right? The way that a pardon is granted here is actually it's the government of Canada through the Minister of Public Works or Public Safety, so one of the cabinet ministers, will be the ones to choose the people who are going to be pardoned. And then once they've approved or denied that, well, when they've approved that, then they bring the actual pardon to the Governor General to sign. Right? So in other words, the Governor General of Canada is literally a rubber stamp. Right, that's all they are. They are a signature to make the official, the document official. That is the power of the monarchy in Canada. It is ceremonial. It is nothing but a rubber stamp. Right, so that of course is how politics has played out over the past 100 or so years, in the sense that democracy now is the upheld as the standard for the best type of government, the rule of the people. And if we were to retain any sort of monarchy or king, really they don't have any power or any influence, unlike, of course, the kings and emperors of the past. These kings and emperors did have very real power and control and influence over the area that they live in. And our passage today is basically a really great example of what we call a contrast in characters. This is an ancient literary device that's used to really teach us something about how we should basically respond to Jesus. Right? So that's what Matthew is doing here. He's giving us all of these contrasts of different kings in Matthew 2, 1 to 12, in order to give us an idea of what that is. So there are three types of kings, or three characters who can be considered to be kings in our passage today. Although, to be honest, the second one is kind of a dubious type of king. Right? I think you probably have an idea of what I'm talking about. But let's turn to Matthew 2, verses 1 to 2. Not going. Matthew 2, 1 to 2. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and we have come to worship him. Right? So again, three types of kings in this situation. And the first king is this person, Herod or Herod the Great. So this Herod the Great, was born in 37 BC, and he died in 4 BC. Can you, and he died in 4 BC, and he started the dynasty, the Herodian dynasty, right? So now the name Herod might sound familiar to you because you would know from the crucifixion of Jesus that another King Herod took part in the trial of Jesus, but that King Herod is actually the son of this King Herod. This is Herod the Great. His son, Herod Antipas, was the king in Judea at the time when Jesus was being crucified. So father and son here. Now, while Herod the Great was the king of Judea, he was not in the line of David. So that's something really important to know about him. He was not actually a proper monarch in Israel because he didn't descend from the line of David. Instead, in 47 BC, he was appointed as the governor of Galilee by the Romans, who were, of course, the actual ruling authority in Israel at that time. Right. Then in 40 BC, after helping repel an invasion of Israel, he was officially appointed as a ruler of the larger areas of Judea, and this basically made him essentially the king of the Jews in that sense, right? However, he was still having to contend with this idea of, like I said, the Roman Empire, which is really the true governing authority in that section. And so when Augustus became the first emperor of Rome in 27 BC, he basically had to kind of, do some political maneuverings in order to really solidify his position. So in that sense, he became king, not because of his right to be king as a descendant of David, but because of his political shrewdness or his military ability, right? So he became king because he was appointed by the Roman Empire, right? So in that sense, he was something they would call a vassal. Right, so he was a subordinate king. He only holds his position as long as he was allied with the true ruling authority, which is, of course, the Roman Empire and whoever was the emperor at the time. Right. Having said that, as I said, he still had some very real power and real authority within the area that he controlled. So he was still a powerful king, nevertheless, in the sense of ancient kings. However, he was a subordinate king to the emperor, the Roman Empire, right? The next type of king, quote unquote, that we have are the 3 kings. Still not working, bro. Sorry. Was that me or you? Okay. All right. So the next types of kings that we have mentioned here are actually the wise men, right? So now I call them kings here because, of course, there is a very popular and well-known Christmas carol called We Three Kings, right? We three kings of Orient are, right? So this carol was written in 1863, and unfortunately, it wasn't actually very accurate. So first of all, the wise men were not actually kings. This mistaken idea that the wise men were kings. So you even saw that in the video, right? One of them had a crown. But this idea that the wise men were king comes from some prophecies in Isaiah, specifically Isaiah 60 verse 3, and also in Psalm 68 verse 29 and 72 verse 10, which prophesy that kings will come and they will worship and bring gifts to the Messiah. Right? So that's where this idea of the wise men being kings come from. However, it is generally understood in Matthew 2 is not a fulfillment of those prophecies. Right? So yes, kings will come and bring gifts and worship Jesus, the Messiah. However, Matthew 2 is not one of them. These were just wise men, just regular old wise men. And the second inaccuracy from the song is this idea that there were 3 of them. Right, so you can probably guess why they thought there were 3 wise men, because they had 3 gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But just because there were 3 gifts doesn't necessarily mean there were 3 wise men. right? So the fact that they're called wise men means plural. There's at least two, but it's not necessarily three. It could have been more. It could be 3, it could be 30. Most likely it was a large group of them, right? They would have had to make that long journey. Very likely there was more than 3 of them. It just so happened that they brought 3 gifts to Jesus. Now then, what do we make of the fact that they're called wise men? And to be honest with you, the resources that I looked into this are kind of in contrast to each other. They can't really quite agree in terms of what to think of the wise men in general, this type of person back into those days. So the main disagreement is basically how to understand this basic idea of them looking at the stars, right? So that was like one of their main functions as magi, as wise men, is that they look at the stars. And the question is, are they more like astrologers or are they more like astronomers? Right? So astrologers or astronomers. Now I know those words sound very similar, but there really is a very big distinction between them. Astronomers are scientists, right? They study the universe. The famous astrologer that I know of is Raj from The Big Bang Theory. But basically that's what they do. They send telescopes up into the atmosphere, and they study the universe around us, right? Meanwhile, astrologers, well, they basically write horoscopes, right? So that's the idea of astrology. What actually I think is the case is it's somewhere in between, right? So there's this idea of astronomers were really valued in ancient times, even before scopes and all. I think they would have been valuable in the sense of they would have been able to observe the stars and predict the seasons as they come. They can really watch the phases of the moon and of the sun. They would have created the first calendar as a result of that. So all of that is scientifically based. And then, of course, the big thing that we kind of know about astronomers that they're able to do, which is already kind of shown in our passage today, is that they would have been able to navigate through something called celestial navigation, right? So, of course, before there was something called GPS, they would have had to, if you were navigating a long distance on Earth, you would have had to do it by celestial navigation, by looking at the stars to determine your position on Earth, right? In fact, this is so important that the U.S. Navy apparently only stopped teaching it in 2006. Right, so that's how important it was to be watching and observing the stars and the movement of the skies above us. Right, so there is a legitimate reason for astronomy, for them to be considered to be astronomers. However, at the same time, of course, they did have this situation where they were practicing astrology, which is basically this idea that you can predict someone's character or personality or even events that were going to happen in human history based on the position of the stars, right? So that is kind of one side of it. They're probably somewhere in the middle. In addition to that, they were basically magicians. They're divinators. And because of all of that kind of knowledge that they actually held very high positions in the courts of many kings and emperors. They were very influential advisors, right? They were this kind of astronomer, astrologer, divinator, counselors to ancient kings and emperors, right? So now these particular wise men that we have, we're told, came from the east, which most likely meant Persia or also Babylon, that's modern-day Iraq and Iran, by the way. And basically, the interesting thing to me about that is that, first of all, if they were from Persia or from Babylon, how did they even hear about this idea of a king of the Jews, let alone be able to predict and figure out this star that was going to show them where he was? Right? Well, the prophecy, interestingly enough, comes from all the way back in Numbers, right? So the book of Numbers, in Numbers chapter 22 to 24, it came through this person named Balaam, who, despite being a Gentile, a non-Jew, and despite being a pagan, and also he would have been a magician, kind of shaman type person, he unwittingly becomes a prophet of Yahweh, of God. Right? So what happened is that Balak, the king of the Moabites, who you'll remember is one of the main enemies of Israel at the time, he hires Balaam to basically curse Israel so that he can destroy Israel. But before Balaam could do so, in Numbers 22 verse 12, God said to Balaam, "You shall not go with them. You shall not curse the people, for they are blessed." Right? So God tells Balaam, no, you can't do this. You can't bless Israel. Right? So Balaam tells Balak this, but Balak still insists that Balaam should join him and curse Israel. And sure enough, Balaam pronounces blessings instead of curses on Israel. So he does so in four oracles, four prophecies. And the final one is a really interesting prophecy. And it's this, from Numbers 24, verses 17 to 19. "I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Israel, and a scepter shall rise out of out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. It shall crush the forehead of Moab and break down all the sons of Sheth. Edom shall be disposed. Seir also, his enemies, shall be disposed. Israel is doing valiantly, and one from Jacob shall exercise dominion and destroy the survivors of the cities." Right? So if you have ever wondered where this idea of the Star of Bethlehem comes from, it's not just Matthew. It does come from the Old Testament, from this really kind of obscure prophecy from Numbers, of all places. Right? So still though, this is Numbers. And these are pagan wise men from Persia. How is it that they could have possibly known about this obscure prophecy in Numbers? Well, obviously, the reason for that is the Babylonian captivity, right? So, of course, I'm forgetting the dates now, but Israel, the northern, or at least the northern kingdom of Judah, was finally conquered by Babylon. And as part of having been conquered, what the Babylonian emperor at the time did was he took a lot of the people of Israel and he transplanted them into the Babylonian kingdom. These people obviously had to live their lives there, but not just that, they ended up having to join, a lot of times, the courts of the king and the emperor of Babylon. The best example of this is, of course, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Right? So these were Jewish men who were taken because of their intelligence and their good looks and stuff like that. They were taken into the courts of the emperor of Babylon. And during these 70 years of captivity, the Jewish religion, the Jewish scriptures were spread throughout the courts of the king, of the emperor of Babylon. Right? Eventually, Babylon was overtaken, was conquered by the Persian Empire, and it is eventually the Persian Emperor Cyrus who allowed the Jewish people to return to Israel. However, of course, that happened after the influence of people like Daniel. Like, remember the story of Daniel, how influential, how well loved he was by the emperor. After they've had a chance to spread their influence and their knowledge of Jewish scripture to the people around them, right? And so incredibly, what we have here is these magicians, this magician, soothsayer named Balaam, a pagan prophet, was hired to curse Israel, that led to the Babylonian captivity, the worst thing that could have happened to Israel. And what we have as a result of these two things happening are these wise men who know about the scripture and who decide to watch the stars and are the ones who notice that just star that was a little bit off, a little bit different from the others that they would have been observing for all those times, and realize, hey, this is it. This is the prophecy that Balaam in Numbers 24 prophesied, right? So it's these wise men, incredibly, that are going to come these Gentiles, these pagans, very likely, who are going to come, and they're going to come and worship the king. Right? So now, again, do you see the contrast that's being built up here? We have the wise men, and we have Herod. And not just Herod, but really all of the ruling authorities of Israel. Right? Matthew 2:3-6, we're told of their reaction to Jesus. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes and of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, is the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Right? So verse 3 really says it all for me. Right? When Herod the king heard of this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Now, obviously, Matthew wasn't saying that all of Jerusalem, everyone in Jerusalem, was troubled. Very likely that not everyone in Jerusalem would have heard what the wise men said, but likely everyone would have known that the wise men were there. That would have been a big commotion or a big event that would have happened. But generally, what's understood is by all Israel, or all Jerusalem with him, is that these are the ruling elites of Jerusalem, of Judea at the time. Right? So these would have been the Pharisees and the Sadducees. These were the people who were governing Israel, at least in terms of their law, along with Herod. Right? So this is what they were faced with, this was their response when they heard about this king of the Jews being born. They were troubled along with them. And to be clear, they knew that they were talking about the Messiah. Right? Because that's what's made clear in verse 4. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. So they knew who they were talking about. This was the long-promised Messiah, the King of the Jews, the descendant of David, who was going to be the Savior of Israel. So they knew who this was, and yet when they heard that he was born, they were troubled. Right? So this is just a huge contrast to what the wise men were intending. Right? And by the way, that prophecy there is from Micah 5, verse 2. They were troubled by hearing this prophecy. Right? And then Herod, worst of all, hatches this plan, verses 7 and 8. Then Herod summoned his wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, go and search diligently for the child. When you have found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him. Now, this sounds like a good thing. This sounds like Herod is intending to go and find this king, the Messiah, and worship him too. But then in Matthew 2, verse 12, the wise men were warned, and being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Right? So obviously Herod was up to no good. Right? It's already obvious by the fact that he was troubled that he wasn't intending to worship Messiah. Now we'll cover exactly what he did in a couple of weeks, but just a little hint, it unfortunately involved killing of innocent children. Right? But basically, this is what Herod's evil plan was starting to hatch up. Right? It's a huge contrast to the way that these Gentile astronomer, astrologer, divinator, wise men were responding to Jesus. The Jewish leader, Herod, were all troubled at hearing that the wise men, that the Messiah was born. Right. So again, this is what instead the wise men were doing. In contrast to this. So Matthew 2, 9 and 11. After listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshiped him. Then opening the treasure, they offered him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Right? So just to be clear about what their response was, like right here. They rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. They fell down and worshiped him. And then they offered him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. right? So let's talk about the gifts first. These gifts, there are generally some understandings of the significance of these gifts. Gold, most people believe, symbolizes Jesus' kingship, right? Obviously, gold, very precious metal, symbolizes kingship. Frankincense symbolizes Jesus' divinity. And the reason for this, the reason people believe this, is that frankincense was actually an ingredient of for the incense that the Jewish people used to offer up to God. So it's one of the ingredients used for that. And then finally, the myrrh symbolizes Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. This is because myrrh is one of the spices that's used to mask the smell of a decaying corpse, right? So they would do that. They would rub this over the body of someone who recently died, bury him, and at least for a short while, that would mask the smell, right? So these are the generally understood significance of these gifts. I don't doubt that there was likely a significance to the gifts that the wise men gave, but the fact of the matter is these are just guesses, right? The Bible never really tell us why these are the gifts that they gave. What really is more important for us to understand, rather than trying to ponder these gifts, is to take it all together as part of their response to the King of the Jews, their response to Jesus, right? Again, they rejoiced, they worshiped, and they made offerings to Jesus, right? That was their response. They were bowing down, they were worshiping the King, right? And here's the really, really interesting thing. So they would have come from Persia, right? And the king of Persia, the thing about them is that even though by this time they would have been also vassals of the Roman Empire, but the king of Persia, up until like 600 AD, the title that they gave themselves was King of Kings, right? So this is really interesting to me, how these wise men who are serving in the courts of the King of Kings would, through this ancient prophecy told to them by this exiled people in their land, would come to realize and recognize that no, the king of Persia isn't the King of Kings. It's someone else, right? The King of Kings is this baby who was born to serve humanity, right? This is the true King of Kings. They're bowing down and they're worshiping him. They're giving their offering to him, right? So Jesus, as a baby, born in a manger to a poor family in very shameful circumstances, if you'll remember my previous sermons, he is the true King of Kings. And so these wise men become the very first, if you'll remember the idea of the book of Matthew, it's written so that the Gentiles might come to know Jesus. Even though it was written for the Jews, the idea is that they're going to preach the word, the gospel, to the Gentiles. And so right here at the very beginning, we have the very first Gentiles who, as the Apostle Paul tells us in Philippians 2, 9-11, therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Right? These three wise men, well, probably not three, these wise men who came to Jesus, who were originally serving someone called the King of Kings in Persia, they came and they bowed down, they rejoiced and they worshiped and they gave offering to the true King of Kings. Like eventually every knee, every tongue confess will do, right? So here's my question for you. Which response is what you're going to have? Which response will you have? Are you going to be troubled like Herod and the Jewish leaders? Troubled to hear about the Messiah? Right? Now, to be honest, it's kind of understandable that they would be troubled. Right? After all, Herod was the king of the Jews. He went through a lot of trouble and a lot of conniving and his military victory to attain this position of king of the Jews. And then to hear these wise men come and say, no, there's another baby who's born king of the Jews. Right? You can kind of appreciate how he might be troubled with that. Right? And meanwhile, the Jewish leaders, now of course it's not clear here, but eventually in the Gospels we're going to see that they are confronted by Jesus for the way that they are interpreting the law to their advantage. In other words, they were hypocrites, right? John the Baptist calls them a brood of vipers. They were using the law for their own personal gain. Like surely they were going to be troubled also by this Messiah who's going to come and fix things, right? So there's this logic behind them being troubled because Jesus was a threat to them, right? It makes sense, not that it's a good thing, obviously, but it makes sense that they're troubled when Jesus comes and it's threatening their way of life, right? And the fact of the matter is, this is the response of many people today. I think of, for example, the new atheists. I know they're not so popular now, but my question for someone like Richard Dawkins, who writes books about how much Christianity is so evil and everything, my question for them is like, why are you so concerned? Like, if you really believe that there's no God, like, who cares? Why do you care so much? Right? Of course, the reason is Christianity threatens him. It threatens the things that he cares about. And in fact, there's this bus campaign that these new atheists put on, which really revealed the story or what's at the core of their issue, right? So this bus campaign, there's this slogan that they were trying to push. There's probably no God, so relax and enjoy life, right? So in other words, why they were really concerned about convincing people that there's no God is that they don't want God to interfere with their enjoyment of life, right? The problem, of course, with that is that the enjoyment of life of this world is destructive, right? That's why we hear about celebrities who are depressed, who unfortunately commit suicide or overdose on drugs. Why? Like, these people are the height of the desire and the pleasures of the world, and yet it doesn't bring them joy. Right? And then to give you a biblical example, we have Solomon, of course. He had 700 wives, 300 concubines. He had all the money he could have. It says that they were so rich that silver was like nothing to them. Right? So that's how rich Israel was at the time of Solomon's rule. He had all the wives, all the women that he could possibly want, the power that he could want. And yet in Ecclesiastes, he opens it by saying, vanities of vanities, all is vanity. Right? Another translation would say, worthless, worthless. Everything is worthless. Right? These are the people who have attained the heights of what this world has to offer. Have attained the best thing that every hedonist could possibly want. And yet, vanities of vanities, everything is worthless, right? And if you're going to be honest with yourself, the truth is there's still a little bit of that in us who are believers. There's still a little bit of rebellion in us, right? When I was a teenager, I grew up a Christian, basically, but when I was a teenager, the kind of the popular thing to talk about was, oh, I wish I'd become a Christian later so that I could have fun before becoming a Christian and stopping doing all those fun things, right? Yet again, though, those fun things, the things that this world thinks are fun, thinks are worthy of our youth and our attention, is really destructive, right? 1 John says, do not love the world or the things in the world, for the things of the world are not from the Father. For all the things of the world, the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, and the pride of life, it's not from the Father, but it's from the world, and the world is passing away along with its desires. That's what the world can give, right? And so, really, the only true and proper response is the response of these pagan astronomer, astrologer, divinators, wise men who came, and they bowed down and rejoiced at Jesus. Right? Because we know, 1 Corinthians 1, verse 18, for the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. Right? Jesus is the power of God. This is what this baby in a manger represents. He is the King of Kings who came down, who forsook the title. What did the video say? He was the Prince of Heaven. Right? But he forsook that. He came down and he came to serve the lost. He came to serve us. There's just no other way that we can respond to that but to rejoice, to worship, right? And so this is my encouragement to you. Stir up your hearts with affection for Jesus. Do whatever you can do. Do whatever you need to do in order to bring yourself to that place where you are rejoicing and you're worshiping. You're offering up your life to Jesus. That's the only way that we can respond to the salvation that he has given us, that he has offered us. Right? And if I may say so, one very excellent way of doing that, I'm going to bring this up every sermon until January. One very great way to do that is reading the Bible through and through. Get in that habit of reading scriptures, right? GCFtoronto.com/word. You can see all of the resources that we've given you. Let's do this. Let's join together. Let's stir up our affections for Jesus by being in his word together. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we praise you, Lord, and we love you, and we thank you for who you are and what you are doing here in our midst, Lord. I pray that you would just let this message penetrate our hearts to know that it is only right that we rejoice and we worship and we offer up to you, Lord. That's the only way that we could possibly